Good day. Why should a course on extreme energy efficiency consider electricity? Well, because the energy future is efficient and electric, strongly reinforcing each other. Shifting from fossil fuels to renewable and often distributed electricity competes with efficient end use to deliver the same services, but it also increases system efficiency and increases efficiency's value. These two things are complementary, and each helps the other to displace fossil fuels faster. And ever since electric utilities were born about 140 years ago, using electricity more efficiently or more timely could displace power plants that were costly to build and to run. Saving or shifting the time of using a kilowatt hour typically costs between a few cents and nearly zero, or less if more than paid for by, say, maintenance costs. But in the past few years, modern renewables have also come to cost only a few cents per kilowatt hour to build and run, less than fossil fueled or nuclear plants cost just to run, even if building them were free. And thus, for the first time, two methods with broadly similar economics, efficiency and renewables, are together displacing fossil fuels. Both of them need a brief upfront investment, and then they have virtually zero operating cost. Though efficiency and modern renewables each cost just a few cents per kilowatt hour, those costs are often measured in different places. Efficiency and on-site renewable power are delivered behind the retail meter, but big so-called utility-scale renewables are wholesale delivered to that meter by grids whose U.S. costs and losses average 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and much more than that for U.S. households whose retail price averages 13 odd cents, while the average wholesale price is 3 or 4 cents, and most of the difference is delivery cost. Utility customers can avoid grid costs only by making their own electricity. Rooftop solar power on homes costs about 3 times more than utility scale solar, or 2 times on commercial roofs, but measured in different places. And because power made on your roof avoids delivery cost, today both these resources, residential and commercial rooftop solar, can often beat grid power in the US, in Australia, and ever since 2014 in Japan. Most end-use efficiency remains several-fold cheaper still, beating solar panels regardless of their location, but inviting a solar plus efficiency combination that further reduces total cost and thus helps solar to spread faster. But today's energy revolution isn't just replacing fuels with electricity. It's also providing the electricity in radically different ways and scales. We're used to seeing this iconic image for electricity. Transmission towers and high voltage wires marching across the landscape symbolize the world's most complex pre-internet machine. $30 trillion in US replacement cost, about $13 trillion in net book value, slightly over half for generators, and the rest for the grid, transmission and distribution. But while major expansions of transmission do have their enthusiasts, the electricity future could, if allowed to, evolve to look less like this ubiquitous past and more like the prosperous little country of Denmark, which sends us a postcard from the future. Denmark in 3 decades has shifted from centralized power plants on the left in red, burning mainly coal, to distributed wind turbines on the right in blue, 86% locally owned, and cogeneration in brown, often burning agricultural wastes. By 2016, the central electricity-only plant's 1980 output was 99.9% gone. GDP grew 72%, but total electricity production fell 24% due to efficiency and fuel switching. Primary energy intensity fell 49%, final energy intensity fell 44%, while CO2 intensity fell 67%. Just in the 12 years to 2016, Denmark cut its electricity generating use of oil by 88%, gas 5%, coal 73%, and renewable output rose over 10-fold. Denmark is on or ahead of schedule for 100% renewable electricity uh, by 2035, and renewable heat as well, and for 100% renewable total energy by 2050 at essentially no extra cost. An eighth of Denmark's total exports now come from its world-class clean energy industries. A major driver of this transition is the economics of unit size. This book, Small is Profitable, The Hidden Economic Benefits of Making Electrical Resources the Right Size, was conceived as I wrote the 1976 Foreign Affairs paper reframing the energy problem. At that time, the notion that small but mass-produced energy technologies might be useful and worthwhile was generally dismissed as romantic, quaint, and frankly crazy. Assembling and organizing strong contrary evidence into a coherent techno-economic book turned out to take 27 years, I think a record gestation period. But after long and painful labor, this big and unarguable book finally emerged from the birth canal in 2002, thanks to our patient sponsors and especially to co-author Joel Swisher. It's now free online in English. It's influential also in Japanese. It was warmly received. It instantly became the definitive study of scale, and I expect it may long remain so. Nobody else would be crazy enough to put that much work into it. Spanning some big silos, it combined financial economics, especially tools for quantifying and managing investment risk, with electrical engineering. That heady mix, that mashup spiced with a lot of other ingredients, revealed 207 economic benefits of distributed systems that make them far more valuable than previously thought, both to the power system and to society. In fact, often by roughly tenfold or more valuable before counting traditional externalities. Your actual costs will vary, often widely, but it's unusual for distributed benefits not to transform the business case and flip the result. We analyzed only electric systems, but a side study for EPA found that about 2/3 of the scale effects applied also to water and wastewater systems. And I'm sure their application is much wider than that. What's the right size is a very fruitful question in practically any field. And importantly, this work analyzed electric supply, but it did not analyze efficient use, where most of the same scale effects apply. That's a big conservatism in our discussion of the economics of energy efficiency. Now, central generation of power grew to gigawatt, billion watt, or to multi-gigawatt unit size by exploiting a century of strong economics or economies of unit scale. And that made sense in the early 20th century when power plants were costlier and less reliable than the grid. So different power plants had to be combined via the grid to ensure reliable and economical supply. The grid also shared costly generating capacity across all customers' diverse loads, and often made big and urban customers subsidize electrification for rural customers. But those economies of scale ran out of steam, literally. Central thermal power plants, steam raising plants, stopped getting more efficient in the 1960s. They stopped getting bigger in the 70s, cheaper in the 80s, bought in the 90s, renewed in the aughties, economically operable in the teens, and considered necessary in the 20s. And now they're being rapidly retired as impressive and venerable white elephants that served us well until they became obsolete. And meanwhile, a powerful new structural logic emerged. By the start of the 21st century, the industry's bedrock assumptions had quietly reversed. New railcar deliverable combined cycle gas power plants cost less per kilowatt than the grid did, and generation got so reliable that about 98 or 99% of power failures began in the grid, which hauls the average US electron something like 400 or 500 kilometers. So the grid, spreading out concentrated power from central stations to distributed customers, had become the main cause of retail power costs and interruptions. Meanwhile, in 2020, US rooftop solar power officially became cheaper on average than grid power per delivered kilowatt hour. And therefore, the cheapest most reliable power can now be produced reliably at or near the customers. It's what we call distributed. But what is the right size for the job? Well, strikingly, while a standard big thermal power station generates about 1 gigawatt, 1 million kilowatts, 1,000 megawatts, most end uses need millionths of a kilowatt, like a little LED light, to a few kilowatts, like an electric stove or a water heater. The average electric power density of a US house is roughly a 20th the power density of the solar energy falling on it, energy density. So rooftop solar cells converting a fifth of that sunlight to electricity could more than power the house. The average density of electricity used in the lower 48 United States is thousands of times smaller than the solar energy falling on that land area. Now, some noted authors claim that electricity sources can't do much unless they're extremely dense, think uranium. But I've never understood that argument. You can, however, have some fun calculating that a gram of silicon in a modern photovoltaic cell can, over its lifetime, produce more useful energy than a gram of plutonium in a fission reactor. Here are some examples of mismatched scale. Most of the end-use devices important to our daily lives need 10 to the minus 1 watt to 10 to the 3 watts, and they're clustered within living or working units needing about 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 5 watts. Most production processes of practical interest have long been carried out in units about that same size. So why does the electricity system traditionally convert fuel to power in units on the order of 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 10 watts? Well, largely because that fitted the needs of big institutions harnessing traditional economies of unit scale. And those were real while they lasted, but then the overlooked diseconomies of unit scale turned out to be much bigger. What are those diseconomies that we examined in Small is Profitable? Well, the end papers of that book look like this. Our taxonomy of distributed benefits in Small is Profitable is systematically organized. So a 5-layer table of contents substitutes for an index. And all 207 distributed benefits, not including a 208th one that someone later discovered, are listed on this eye chart inside the end papers to illustrate their scope and granularity and variety. And there are 4 main kinds. First, there are financial economics benefits. Those often increase the value of right-sized electrical systems by an order of magnitude, roughly a factor 10, for renewables, or half an order of magnitude for non-renewables. The electrical engineering benefits are typically worth several-fold increase in value, but a lot more where and when the distribution grid is congested or the customer needs premium quality, reliability, or quality, typically for medical or digital uses or for sensitive industrial processes. And there's a petting zoo of miscellaneous benefits that are often worth about a factor 2 in extra value, but more than that with thermal integration, typically recovering waste heat from thermal electric generation and using it to make useful heat or cooling or sweet water. And finally, the analysis notes that diverse social and environmental externalities are often valuable, but we didn't try to quantify them since a large scholarly and regulatory literature already does that. Now, these 4 kinds of collective benefits breaking into 94 categories swamp virtually any marginal cost difference on which choices of electric technologies are typically based. Even 2 decades ago, they could tip almost any supply-side investment decision from central toward distributed and from fuel toward renewable. This was really heretical in 2001 when Joel Swisher showed how a small subset of distributed benefits made even handcrafted fuel cells at $3,000 a kilowatt cost-effective. It was heretical in 2014 for behind-the-meter batteries. Utilities and investors at first recoiled in shock, and then they began to smell the profits. And now at least some attention to scale effects is becoming common and expected. With solar and wind power adding 95% of net new capacity worldwide now, at least it is now unarguable that economies of mass production and rapid learning overwhelm the old economies of unit size. So what was heretical when we published this in 2002 is now overwhelmingly obvious. And of course, they thought of it all along. Well, 10 long years ago, RMI's eLab consortium reviewed 13 industry and 2 national lab studies seeking to quantify the main benefits of distributed photovoltaics. The studies were all incomplete and spotty, but some found distributed benefits justifying what was then quite a high cost for photovoltaics without even valuing their electricity. That's how much had been overlooked. Now, conversely, today's cheap PV systems can often profit from energy sales without counting their distributed benefits. But either way, the uncounted money on the table can make moot some common regulatory debates. Even if so many customers buy PVs that you start to worry about net metering's small distributional effects, they will be smaller than system benefits to all customers. And ultimately, under what I call a bidirectional value tariff, customers and providers could pay each other the fair market value of the services they're exchanging. The societal value of rooftop PVs is disputed as anti-solar or anti-competition lobbyists try to kill net metering. That's the ability to sell homemade power back to the grid at the retail price. Most states, shown in dark blue, allow net metering. However, while distributed PVs provide free value to the grid worth more than the retail electricity tariff, according to 8 of the 11 studies, those are the ones done by or for regulators or independent analysts, there are 3 utility studies that found the opposite, mainly by omitting many kinds of benefits. There was a 2019 update, the first reference shown, showing that only half of 16 value of solar studies at that time were counting any societal benefits. None of these studies were done by or for utilities. So interests favoring fossil fuel generation oppose net metering in the name of avoiding a supposedly inequitable cost shift that's almost always fictitious or small or both, until I have a view on this issue. So 2 takeaways here. First, distributed solar could have big net benefits to all customers, but analytic quality and purpose vary widely, and findings are strongly correlated with sponsorship. Nonetheless, the California Public Utilities Commission has brought these issues into a furious debate, and so far has greatly reduced compensation to both past and prospective rooftop PV purchasers. This perverse policy seems likely to drive more customers to add storage and some to try to escape from the grid. So it heightens risks to the utilities that promoted this policy shift. Now, another major benefit of well-designed distributed systems is resilience. Of the 11 studies you just saw, 2 of them valued resilience at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, the rest at 0. But a more sophisticated NREL study in 2018 of 2 US use cases, a primary school and a big office, found that resilience benefits justified larger PV systems and order of magnitude larger batteries, while at least doubling the net present value of those choices. Valuing resilience could therefore elicit more resilience. Texas could have used some in February 2021 when a significant fraction of the blackout came from the distribution system, most of the rest from failed central thermal plants, while renewables outperformed for all but 10 hours. Let me run through some illustrations of some basic distributed benefits so you'll start to get a feel for this little treasure house. Let's start with financial economic benefits. Those come from the value of minimizing regret at what you did you wish you hadn't, or what you didn't do you wish you had. Smaller and faster investments reduce financial risk from imperfect foresight and from lumpy rather than granular capacity. And as the graph shows, it's therefore worth paying nearly 3 times more per kilowatt for a 10 kilowatt resource you can build overnight than for a 50 megawatt resource you can build in 2 years. Just falls out of the math. But the small and fast resource may actually cost less per kilowatt hour, not more. Why is that? Well, Portable resources can be relocated to reoptimized locations. So you put it where you think will be best for the system. System evolves differently than you thought. That's okay. Take it down, put it on the truck, and take it to where it ought to be. So that reduces risk and raises value. The ability to build as you need and pay as you go cuts financial risk. Modular short lead time technologies capture rapid learning and economies of mass production. The effects that just cut PV prices by about fivefold in 5 years. Renewables and efficiency offer long constant price contracts, while volatile gas prices add risk worth about as much as the gas. But as we'll see in Lecture 7b, scandalously ignored, regulators ought to require risk adjustment for fair comparison. A diversified supply portfolio should have a substantial fraction of financially riskless, that is constant price renewables, even if they cost more, for exactly the same reason that investors include riskless treasury debt in financial portfolios, even though it yields less. Such risk diversification improves overall returns, or for electricity, it lowers long-run expected prices. That's, again, pretty basic financial economics. And then cogeneration, like efficiency, has an insurance-like benefit of gaining value just when you most need it. Well, all this is just bedrock financial economics 101, and yet hardly any regulators have begun to require it be considered. And the investment community, while intently focused on the economics, the economies of production scale, is still not systematically counting a lot of these other important sources of value. However, these practices could be changed, making gas prices more accurate and much higher without needing any federal legislation. Now, for these and other reasons, Bloomberg New Energy Finance forecasts the median power plant sizes in Europe will fall from nearly 600 megawatts in 2020 to 120 megawatts by 2035 to 32 megawatts by 2050. That's a total drop of 20-fold. They forecast that Europe's fraction of generation that's directly injected into the distribution grid will rise from 24 to 67%. And they forecast that global median unit size of generators will fall 6-fold. So small is not just theoretically profitable, it's taking over the market. And this huge shift implies far more omnidirectional flow in more richly interconnected and perhaps lower voltage grids with new modes of control and with greater resilience if they're designed and run properly and sited in a far more distributed fashion. Now, let's back up a minute from supply to see the bigger picture. Electricity is an immense, complex, powerful industry. In 2017, electricity was 19% of the world's final energy, but it was 65% of global coal demand, 40% of global gas demand, 42% of fossil CO2, 48% of sulfur oxides, 49% of total energy investment, and 39% of consumers' energy bills, all very disproportionate to its share of final energy. So saving electricity has huge leverage for saving fuels and costs and emissions. In advanced economies, electrical savings already outpace economic growth. 18 of 30 International Energy Agency member nations shrank their absolute use of electricity from 2010 to 17. More efficient use cut all 30 nations' average electricity demand growth rate by more than 4/5, from 1.6% a year to 0.3% a year. That's a great start, but how much more could be saved? IEA's stated policy scenario finds about 10,000 terawatt hours a year, 10 petawatt hours a year of efficiency gains are feasible by 2050 just from government policies already announced, even if they're not fully realized. Well, that compares with projected generation of 50 petawatt hours, 32 of it from renewables in 2050, or 28 petawatt hours in 2022. In other words, it's the savings that policies could do by 2050 is about a third as big as total generation now. And however, that reflects some traditional assessments, and it includes very little integrative design. We included more integrative design, although we left out a lot of it in industrial processes in our Reinventing Fire synthesis in 2011. And yet, we showed there how by 2050, at a historically reasonable pace, very profitably tripled or quadrupled energy efficiency in buildings, which use 3/4 of US electricity, and doubled energy efficiency in industry, could shrink total electricity use 25%, despite all electric autos and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. So that amounts to quadrupled electric end-use efficiency. And we found that quadrupling of efficiency would cost the provider an average of just 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour saved in today's dollars. That's less than a cent if you round up for various delivery and transaction costs. So that's a tenth of the 10-cent average retail price of US electricity. And I see no reason to suppose the potential savings are much smaller in other countries, even quite efficient ones, since the US is somewhat more efficient than the world average. There's one other little often overlooked point from the even earlier RMI study, Winning the Oil Endgame 2004, that I think is worth revisiting. Back then, we asked how much natural gas can be saved, not just by more efficient and renewable buildings and factories, but also by saving gas-fired electricity specifically. So we found in 2004 that each 1% of electric savings, including the peak hours when simple cycle gas peakers also run, would save 2% of total US gas use. And we found it would cut the gas price by 3 or 4%. That's really interesting. It would be worth updating that calculation as gas price becomes even more sensitive to electricity demand. And together, both kinds of efficiency, electric and the indirect through gas, plus renewables, may strand a lot of assets in both utility industries. Well, a little history. America's electricity use, instead of growing 1% a year as officially forecast in 2010, and still forecast at 0.9% a year in 2022, could shrink 1% a year in a Reinventing Fire scenario, despite completely electrified autos. Well, it's too early to tell for sure what's actually happening, but the actual pattern in orange, jumping all over with weather and economic change, kind of squint a little. I think it doesn't quite look like the 1% a year growth scenario. And later we'll explore how this might change as more sectors get electrified. And the competition here is not only between different generators, what you mainly hear about, it's also with an even cheaper rival, of course, more efficient use. As with fuels, so with electricity, technology and design are both moving efficiency into fast forward. Prior lighting improvements, for example, were largely swept away as LEDs in each decade got 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, and 10 times cheaper. And ultimately, they'll save about an eighth of the world's electricity. We've already seen how dramatic savings are also available in most other sectors and uses. Well, what else changes this fast? Oh, the rest of the energy transformation, modern renewables, because LEDs backwards are PVs, photovoltaics. PV and in aqua wind power costs have plunged below the dashed lines. That's the cost of fossil fuels fed into US thermal power plants. So that's often made old coal, gas, and nuclear plants uneconomic just to operate. In the US, for reasons I explained in the cited Forbes blog, we've been saving fuels twice as fast as electricity. But in the decade after electricity demand peaked in 2007, except for one little weather blip in 2018, the absolute electricity use drifted down 2%, while real GDP grew 15%. And that decoupling has been gathering force for a quarter century, as shown by these benchmarks. I think it's likely to continue. And the industry is grudgingly starting to accept this as the new normal. Jonathan Koomey has actually shown how quintessentially normal it really is. Electricity use decoupled from economic growth in 1994, and electric intensity, once thought to be magically exceptional, has long fallen just as fast as primary energy intensity. That is, the red and green intensity curves have similar slope. And even before the pandemic, most developed and some developing countries were seeing electricity demand growth slump or reverse. And those that refuse to believe it have generally been embarrassed. Let me give you a little Australian example. Big state utilities there overinvested, especially in the grid. They raised prices, and GDP in red kept growing, but electricity demand didn't, the green curve. And that created what Australians call the hedgehog graph. You'll see why they call it that in a minute. So in 2010, they forecast steep demand growth for electricity, but they got shrinkage. In 2011, they delayed the forecast growth for a year and got more shrinkage. In 2012, they started recognizing reality, but kept hoping for growth to return later, and were again disappointed. In 2013, the contradiction intensified with rapid growth of rooftop solar because they count it as a negative load. Australia has about 10 times California's per capita photovoltaic adoption. A third of the homes in Queensland and I think 2/5 in South Australia have rooftop solar power. And that's partly because Australian residential rooftop systems cost a third as much per kilowatt hour. German ones cost half as much as typical American ones do. That's a whole other story. Now, in 2014, the utilities began forecasting more realistically, and demand actually stabilized. So they raised the forecast, wishing we'll make it so demand stayed flat. And so their 2016 prediction started to more or less track actual demand, green line. But then as solar power kept booming and efficiency gained further ground, they cut their forecast again, now expecting another decade of flat net demand. And then during that decade, the already vanished 1/4 of their originally expected sales will rise to 1/3. So the utilities' risk of a death spiral of rising cost and falling demand is not just theoretical. You start to see a spiny hedgehog there, some of the spines lying down toward the right and some of them sticking up and being prickly. Now, rescaling the graph a bit as economic growth continued, the 2018 forecast rose slightly, and then the forecasters cut back in 2019 as actual demand stayed flat. And they cut further in 2020 as the pandemic cut usage. About 29% of Australian homes gained rooftop solar power. 3 states reached record loads for daytime net electricity demand, and that wreaked financial havoc on their utilities. And then in 2021, forecasters cut further when actual GDP dipped in the pandemic. So solar power, mainly from 3 million rooftops, briefly exceeded total electricity demand on the gigawatt scale South Australia grid, so it had to send tens of megawatts surplus to neighboring Victoria. Solar power also exceeded half of demand in the main national grid, or over 62% if you include wind power. And coal use hit record lows. Coal plants, desperate not to shut down, paid up to the maximum of 1,000 Australian dollars per megawatt hour to anybody who would take their power. And for the year, total Australian electricity was 1/3 renewable. Remarkably, by the way, small-scale solar added more capacity than large-scale wind and solar. And yet, more renewable output was still being curtailed because storage and load shifting and green hydrogen hadn't yet caught up with renewable growth. Australia's renewable dominance impressively shows how citizen and corporate interest and state level policy can defeat contrary federal policy, which strongly favored coal over renewables until that federal government was voted out in 2022. And then in 2022, as GDP rebounded, reverted to mean, Australian forecasters became strangely exuberant. Time will tell, but it's not obvious why demand net of burgeoning on-site renewable generation should resume growing at least as fast as it did nearly 2 decades earlier. In October 22, renewables hit a record high of more than 2/3 of total generation on the main grid. And spectacular performance and profits were spreading giant batteries rapidly in several states as renewables get ever cheaper. In Australia, they're just behind China and India. They get, of course, more widespread. Grid operators keep finding solutions faster than problems emerge. It's one of the world's most interesting solar stories. Variants on the hedgehog graph theme have exposed systematic errors in many kinds of forecasting. So this is a handy tool to know about. You need only, as in the lower right graph, to redraw the family of curves as annual changes. Evidently, IEA changed its methodology completely from 2017 to 2019. And Michael Liebreich collects such graphs. In fact, I found 2 more gems on his Twitter feed. One shows how 8 years of fracking innovation wrong-footed hydrocarbon competitors by dramatically flattening the cost curve for oil. And then this one shows how Sweden's national bank changed one of its key rate forecasts over just a 5-year period. Now that's a prickly hedgehog. Anyway, back to electricity. Many claim that these disruptions will reverse because the new climate imperative of beneficial electrification can save money and carbon. So they're promoting new uses of electricity, from marijuana farms to Bitcoin mines to data centers. Well, if done thoughtfully, not just to shore up sagging utility revenue, some new uses can certainly make sense. And RMI analyzes ways for super efficient buildings, for example, to power all end uses with low carbon electricity, to make buildings grid interactive, supporting integration of variable renewables through advanced demand flexibility, and to make connection of gas pipes to new buildings obsolete. What's wrong with this picture? Anybody spot the problem? Yeah, dark roofs. Well, now about 80 US cities and counties, just like the Netherlands and Britain, are restricting or banning new gas hookups. California, Washington, Colorado, New York State are on that path. Massachusetts, Oregon, and Vermont are proposing it. Well, predictably, there's a counter reaction. The gas industry has persuaded 20 states to forbid such bans. So they've protected 31% of US gas use in buildings. As you might expect, this split looks strikingly like the electoral map. But switching to electric heat doesn't need to raise peak loads if you use ground source heat pumps. And Mitsubishi's latest air source heat pumps, vying with Daikin, are providing 100% of rated space heating capacity down to minus 15 C, 70% of it down to minus 30 C. They don't default to resistance heating till minus 35 C. That's minus 31 F. So almost all US climates, not just the South, can now switch from gas heating to this energy and money-saving electric technique. Electric water heating offers load shifting, renewable, and flexibility benefits. And in a fairly typical climate like Illinois, it can beat a gas water heater on net present value cost. If the electric heat pumps COP were raised from under 3 to the remarkable Swiss values we saw in lecture 2C, 6 to 15, you may recall, for a low lift. You've also seen how my house uses a super efficient Swiss electric cooking system, several-fold more efficient than induction. In fact, we just installed the 5th generation upgrade. And thus, new ways to both sell and save household electricity are evolving rapidly. But getting off gas may not mean using much more, if any, household electricity if you coordinate with profitable efficiency in building envelopes and equipment. For example, the 80% lower energy costs expected in Chris Benedict's Brooklyn apartment retrofits that we saw come with 100% electrification, but they're not even yet using these newest technologies. But the electricity transformation is about a lot more than demand, whether or not it comes from fuel switching. You see, powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. These 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves. They hunt in packs. They multiply quickly. They can gobble up half of utility revenues in the 2020s. And together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. In 2014, all central power plants were called dinosaurs. And the full quote is, too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run. Who do you suppose said that? It wasn't Greenpeace. It was Union Bank of Switzerland. And now a new wave of Pac-Man is coming over the horizon. Super cheap batteries may soon make distributed storage so cheap that rooftop photovoltaic 24/7 power could ultimately strand many grid assets, just like phone company copper. Blockchain technology is redesigning the rules of the game, starting with utility billing, certificates of origin, demand response, and transactive energy. It could also make markets clear and grids balanced from the bottom up, not the top down. And RMI's Global Blockchain Consortium at the Energy Web Foundation is building secure and nearly frictionless infrastructure to enable a decarbonized, decentralized, democratized, digitized electricity system. Wasteful reactive power, that is current out of phase with voltage, energy you have to pay for and deliver, but you can't meter or use, that could be eliminated system-wide by very fast and efficient real-time compensators, freeing up grid and generating capacity while reducing energy losses and customer bills and emissions. And then IEEE's Standard 1547, that's been in federal law since 2005, was updated to let solar customers automatically island and keep running through a grid outage so they can sustain their service while protecting line workers. Customers want such resilience, and regulators should make it the default design. And then there are more Pac-Men emerging, like low voltage DC buildings and purely radiant cooling. In short, transformations in efficient use and diverse, dispersed renewable supply are starting to flip the whole electricity sector on its head. Traditionally, utilities built giant coal and nuclear plants, augmented them with big gas plants, and bought a little efficiency in renewables. Those utilities were rewarded for selling more electricity, so that's what they did. But now, especially where regulators instead reward cutting customers' bills, the market is shifting other way up. It's going massively toward efficiency, renewables, cogeneration, and ways to blend them all together reliably, even with little or no bulk electricity storage. So we're on this magical mystery tour to an unknown land, but its general direction is clear. Electricity is shifting from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled, brittle, and analog to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, resilient, and digital. The deepest and most surprising change, I think, will be how the information age informs, enables, and organizes customers to take power into their own hands. You know, it's smart to sell customers what they want before someone else does. Customers are already figuring out they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and timely, produce their own, and even share them with others. For example, Dutch customers can buy renewable electricity directly from other customers on this peer-to-peer website of Van de Bron, literally from the source. A utility executive I know bought his electricity from the guy in the upper left photo because the price in magenta was pretty good, and it's a really cute piglet. And then he got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. What big utility can dream of such customer intimacy? Now, Renewables were lately about 95% of the world's total net additions of generating capacity. The International Energy Agency predicts about 90 to 95% for the next few years, with annual additions rising from 360 gigawatts in 2022 to 460 or even 600 in 2027. Wow. By 2026, IEA expects over 4.8 terawatts of renewable capacity to be installed. In other words, as much as today's total fossil and nuclear capacity combined. That's the renewables expected by 2026. IEA just raised its central forecast of 5-year renewable growth by almost 30% in a single year. They expect renewables to outgenerate coal, the dominant source of power, by 2025. And wind and solar, together 90% of renewable growth, they expect will more than double their generating share and make nearly a fifth of global electricity by 2027, while the shares of all non-renewable sources shrink. So this global rush to renewables, nearly half of it in China, is propelled mainly by competitive cost. Let me give you a little diagram that keeps moving so fast we can't keep up with it. For the United States, where wholesale electricity prices, this aqua range, now widely exceed the average long-term contract prices of wind and solar power, which are temporarily subsidized, but less than non-renewables are. And if you look at unsubsidized world markets, renewables at or below $30 a megawatt hour, the diamonds, keep falling through 20. In Saudi Arabia, they've already hit 10. Modern batteries, included in the filled squares, are already cheaper than gas peakers. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance finds that variable renewables plus backup, whether it's renewable, non-renewable storage, or demand side, are now the cheapest way to beat a steady load. So those combinations have dethroned so-called baseload thermal plants, which no longer have an operational need or a business case. Distributed and renewable supply differs from traditional central thermal power plants in every possible way. The trend, magnitude, and duration of construction investment, fuel costs, other operating costs, emissions, speed of evolution, reliability, resilience, mode of construction, social acceptability. How could prudent investors not shift to the lower risk choice now that it's also generally lower cost? And renewable technologies just keep getting better and cheaper. The US wind resource rose by 2/3 in 7 years, not because the wind blew any harder, but because the towers got taller. Remember, the wind's power rises as the cube of wind speed, like a car's aerodynamic drag inside out. And also because the rotors are being designed to work better in sites with weaker winds. There are other improvements in technology and deployment. So those and other improvements by 2015 had spread the competitiveness of wind power from the dark blue zone, the wind belt up the middle of the country, to the light blue, to the orange areas, to every state in the United States, and the same also in Germany. And these trends continue. We're often told that renewable capacity has to be built in the sunniest and windiest places, even if they're far away, requiring long transmission lines that are slow and costly and politically very hard to build, and they're vulnerable to a mere rifle bullet. But a more local and regional approach can often avoid those lines. So this map shows wind resources in blue, darker is windier. It shows major load centers in red and lesser load centers in yellow. We were told that the upper Midwest and Northeastern states have to bring wind power from the Dakotas and solar power from the desert Southwest. Oh, look at the map again. Actually, offshore wind in the Great Lakes and off the Northeast coast would suffice for those load centers. And across this whole map, the annual solar radiation varies less than twofold, and it's strong in a lot of places with big loads like Texas and Florida, the Sunshine State. New wind turbine varieties can make money even at low wind speeds, and they can average an astonishing 65% capacity factor in windy areas or offshore. So a more regional and local approach often yields about the same economics for medium quality renewables nearby is for best renewables far away, plus the cost of the lines, if you let all technologies and sizes compete fairly. And yet, even though best renewables far away can often no longer beat lesser renewables nearby, many forecasters still claim a need for long new power lines. And in principle, I think those should not be built unless they are the cheapest solution. But that comparison is seldom made. There is a new transmission technology disclosure, I advise this company that can carry 2 or 3-fold more power in a wire the same weight, because the core that supports the wire is carbon fiber composite, not braided steel. So it's many-fold lighter per unit of strength. And this aluminum conductor, very tightly packed, can be simply substituted for existing lines by reconductoring on the same towers using the same equipment and training and methods. So that could save a decade of risky efforts to secure a new right-of-way and could therefore help decongest the grid faster for quick renewable expansion. And the next innovation here could sense within a meter or two by a fiber optic line run inside the real-time temperature, stress, and sag in each conductor, and that would permit true dynamic loading, fully using capacity of the line all the time, and that would further raise its ampacity and its reliability. Offshore wind power can combine outputs into an undersea network that's then linked to urban grids at the shoreline through short underwater cables, and that turns out to be cheaper than long overland lines and probably easier to site, and it's generally cheaper than running individual lines from each wind farm onshore. So offshore wind is booming in Europe with steep price declines. They fell vertically by 55% in a single year for the projects coming on in 2020. And then they're falling another twofold with scale and innovation and experience. And now that experience is starting to benefit the US coasts and the Great Lakes states. Thanks to new federal and state policies, these regions are now approving projects to capture capacity factors often well over 50%, comparable to combined cycle gas, better than coal. So here's a major new renewable industry poised for very rapid growth. In the US, whole system innovations for photovoltaics can get ground mount arrays of 1 megawatt connected straight to distribution down to about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour unsubsidized. They don't need transmission because they feed directly into the local distribution lines. Dr. Joseph Goodman's former Shine team at RMI cut those solar system costs by twice as much as anti-Chinese photovoltaic import tariffs were expected to raise photovoltaic costs. Although, after a year of those tariffs, they had turned out to have no net effect on the market except losing 9,000 US jobs. RMI Shine team first wrung out half the balance of system cost of photovoltaics, enabling DOE's Sunshot program, then joined with industry on 2 more rounds of whole system redesign. And their latest effort had 2 times 8 module solar packets or solo Lego block designs, a highly integrated industrial product that cut the parts count 98%, the land use 10%, and optimized all across the whole value chain for shipping, materials, civil works, electrical and mechanical installation, and wind loads. So RMI then published this work to foment competition in exploiting it, hoping for the 1,000-fold or more leverage we'd previously achieved by doing the same with hypercars. And now these latest solar innovations are starting to enter the market for ground mounts and commercial rooftops and carports. RMI also found ways to cut the cost of African mini-grid power to half the best cost and a quarter the average cost. We applied that approach in Rwanda, and in 2018, RMI's Nigerian charrette confirmed another twofold cost reduction potential over the next few years to about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. That's an eighth the average, or a quarter the best cost. And now Nigeria has built the first under-grid solar mini grid, for communities not connected to the grid running over them. 185 peak kilowatts, 7-year payback. And from Africa to Australia, markets constantly remind us that modern renewables are scaling up in a fundamentally different way. Traditionally, utilities would build these giant cathedral-like power plants, each costing billions, taking many years to license and build. But now each year, with roughly comparable capital, you can build a factory that then produces each year thereafter enough solar cells to generate each year thereafter as much electricity as your cathedral will ultimately make. So you can see in this thought experiment a 15-fold difference in cumulative output over the first 10 years and then running away after that. So solar output worldwide is scaling faster than cell phones. In 2013, China added more solar capacity than the US had added cumulatively in the previous 59 years. In 2016, China doubled its pace to 3 football fields per hour. In 2018, China added more PVs in June than the US added all year. Big complex power plants can simply never catch up. And people who claim that renewables aren't ready or aren't fast enough or lack the oomph, whatever that is, should study the Victoria et al. Paper in your readings. Here's another interesting example. At the end of 2018, coal-dependent Vietnam had 1/10 of a gigawatt of solar power. 2 years later, it had 16.5 gigawatts, the most in East Asia, 1/3 more than the 2025 target they'd set just months before. 9 of that 16 gigawatts was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures. That's equivalent to building half the nation's coal plants in a year. And 72% of that rooftop solar got installed just in the month of December, mostly in late December, before a 9-month window closed for a juicy feed-in tariff. Distributors are now racing to catch up so the unforecast solar output can actually feed back to the grid. So coal, no longer getting automatic loan guarantees, is struggling. It added 1.2 gigawatts in 2020, but offshore and onshore wind power is slated to add 11 gigawatts by 2030, while solar reaches 19 to 20 gigawatts. And this revolution was almost all privately financed by independent producers under standard power purchase agreements. So the government had to rip up its forecast. There's a similar revolution emerging from China's whole country rooftop solar program. In 2017, Chinese rooftop solar was not a thing. By the end of 2021, China had 27 gigawatts of it, growing 8 gigawatts a year. And now rooftop PVs are 30% of world total PV capacity. They're heading for 95 gigawatts by 2025, encouraged by feed-in tariffs and other inducements that are justified by avoided grid costs, increased resilience, local jobs, clean air, and other benefits. In a related US trend, the microgrid market, third quarter of 22, reached 7 gigawatts built, 3 more underway. A lot of microgrids are motivated, again, by resilience needs, and many are delivered as a turnkey service now in 28 states. Now, there's a crucial positive feedback that's explored in that Victoria et al. Paper. As Tom Friedman says, when renewables get cheaper, we buy more, so they get cheaper, so we buy more. And such expanding returns keep outrunning forecasters. So look at these forecast fans from the International Energy Agency. 2002 to 19, they were raised 6.5-fold for wind power. They were raised 36-fold for photovoltaics, and yet they still fell short of reality. IEA was 50 to 100 years off on the timing of the cost curve, and they didn't capture this price volume positive feedback, but investors did. So adding modern renewables is now a $0.4 trillion a year business, 2/3 privately financed. And the world ended 2019 with 50 times the PV capacity that IEA had forecast in 2002. And then renewables really took off, further startling many investors. There's a Dutch analyst, Oke Hoekstra, who famously redrew IEA's PV forecasts hedgehog style to show how they accommodated each year's increasingly obvious gross errors in slope by simply raising the starting point, but then continuing with these flat projections wildly unrelated to the actual market behavior. Well, you can see something started to change in 2020. And here, Oke has added the runaway 2021 data point. The 2022 additions are about 210 to 240 gigawatts of PV, so they're off the top of the chart. So only after 17 years did embarrassment cause reassessment. In 2019, IEA projected that PVs would cost more in 2050 than they did cost in 2019. But then in 2020, 21, IEA made a notable and welcome shift and became a PV enthusiast in red. And yet markets kept moving even faster. China in 2020 more than doubled its previous record for wind power installations. They added 3 times IEA's forecast of 2 months earlier. Almost 72 gigawatts of wind power added. They added 48 gigawatts of solar, 13 of hydro. So China's total 2020 additions were 50 gigawatts above its previous record. The global 2020 renewable additions total an astounding 278 gigawatts, even more 2021, much more 2022, much more expected 2023. Even the new and improved IEA model is apparently still forming renewable prices outside the model, not inside the model. And that constrains renewable growth because it doesn't let the observed learning curves actually work. The model also seems to constrain renewables later on and to overstate storage needs by a black box grid stability model that probably omits many or most grid balancing resources. And they don't seem yet to be comparing or competing efficiency with supply. So what might happen if they corrected just the first of these 3 widespread flaws? Well, the new Oxford INET paper in your readings gives a strong hint, and we're going to return to that later. By the way, they are getting better. The latest revision means the agency in 2022 forecasted 76% more growth in total renewable electric capacity than it had done just 2 years earlier. So they're starting to catch up with what's happening. And this means that extra wind, solar, and other renewable technologies are shown here equivalent to the entire electricity system of India being built by 2026, on top of the 2022 projections. IEA says this year's forecast accounts for a wave of new policies introduced largely in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the soaring fossil fuel prices that triggered. And yet we are still told that only coal and gas and nuclear plants can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind power and PVs are variable and hence supposedly unreliable. But, variable does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in one stormy winter month forecast a day ahead the output of the country's wind farms. They would do well to forecast demand that accurately. And forecasting has improved a lot in the decades since then. In fact, so much so that in 2020, East Danish wind operators proved that they could bid day-ahead wind power into the grid's auction for balancing reserves just as reliably as fossil fuels generators do. And likewise, offshore wind power is now reliably replacing complex and costly redispatch to stabilize the half-renewable German grid. Indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. Giant power plants fail too, losing 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly and for weeks or months. So grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, Grids can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and location. So in Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is only 1% connected to the rest of the country, a 2050 summer week of expected loads can get a lot smaller and less peaky with efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with a mixture of wind and photovoltaics, and the last 14% from dispatchable renewables, geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric, burning ag and municipal and industrial waste, burning feedlot biogas and existing gas turbines, burning obsolete energy studies, that's my favorite. So now you've got 100% renewable supply, but you see it's not a great match to the dashed line, that load you have to meet after efficiency. So to match that load, we can put surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed storage that are worth buying anyway: high storage air conditioning and smart charging of electric autos, and then recover that energy when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. Only then about 5% of the annual electric output from renewables is left over to help decarbonize other sectors. So the economics should be excellent even at today's market prices, let alone lower future prices. Some grid operators already do such choreography today to far exceed the 2020 renewable fraction, which was 38% in Europe, surpassing fossil or nuclear, about 29% in the world then. Now, Germany and Britain and Ireland are half renewably powered. Denmark expected to be 86% renewable in 2021. There's a several year statistical lag there. Scotland, 100%. And I believe they got up to 99%. But already, you know, these and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower are meeting about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electricity needs from renewables. And yet they're adding no bulk storage. They have superior reliability. For Denmark and Germany, it's over 5 times US reliability. The ultra-reliable former East German utility 50 Hertz was 62% renewably powered in 2021. They're targeting 100% renewables, all reliably integrated by 2032. So as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. Thus, in 2020, the maximum percentage of Germany's electricity demand met by variable renewables, that is PVs and wind power, shown as a red dot for each week, reached over half at some time in almost every week. In about half the weeks, it reached somewhere between 80 and nearly 100%. The nuclear and coal phase outs continued, the lights stayed on. They're German engineers, what can I say? In fact, illustrating how quadrupling renewable share is making Germany's electric service more reliable, the white curve shows a standard metric for outages, fluctuating with storms, but trending downwards. And similarly in Texas, where renewable wind power in red tripled in 6 years, while the reserves needed to cover wind shortfalls in blue fell by about half. And then I did an update and found that these trends indeed continued, as they still do. Berkeley Lab maintains every year or two this graph of what various utility or power pool studies show it will cost to balance the grid with medium to high fractions of wind power. And the costs they found are nearly always below $10 a megawatt hour or 1 cent a kilowatt hour. They're usually half that or less. That is, they're a small fraction of the bare levelized cost of energy, LCOE, for wind power alone. But public data from the Texas Grid ERCOT, which unbundles and prices each service separately, suggests that big thermal plants may actually cost 2 or 3 times more than wind farms to integrate into the grid for the same reliability. It's the opposite of what you usually are told. Why do they find that? Well, big thermal plants fail about 5 to 10+% of the time. They fail suddenly in big chunks, often for weeks or months, in unpredictable forced outages. But portfolios of variable renewables fail more gradually, gracefully, briefly, predictably. You can see the weather coming quite a ways off. And central thermal plants have their own firming and balancing costs. We call them things like reserve margin, spinning reserve, cycling costs, part load penalties. And yet those costs have traditionally been socialized without analysis as inevitable system costs. The integration costs of variable renewables should logically be treated that way too, because reliability is a system attribute. And most European experts agree it should not be ascribed or charged to specific projects or technologies. But if they are so charged anyway, then renewables will look even better. Integration costs, you see, are low for variable renewables. They're lower for dispatchable renewables, still an important fraction of global modern renewable output, although by now it's fallen to about 10%. It's probably zero or negative for efficient use. Probably zero or negative for demand response. Is probably rather high for big thermal plants. So if we count grid integration costs, we need to count them for all competitors, not just some. And that comparison will tend to favor renewables over fossil or nuclear. Now, to keep the grid reliable and make it renewable, we can use not just one grid flexibility resource, that is bulk storage like giant batteries in magenta, but about 10 grid flexibility resources, which I've sketched here virtually. They're in gray in order of increasing cost. Your actual cost will vary, but you notice bulk storage comes last, not first. So we needn't wait for a storage miracle, though some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. Now, to be sure, behind the meter batteries do have about 13 more main benefits than just storing energy. They were often cost effective even in 2014, but cost effective doesn't mean competitive. It only means benefits exceed costs. It doesn't mean that there isn't an even cheaper way to get similar benefits. And as you see, there are at least 9 carbon-free competitors like that, many of them rapidly improving. So it's a crowded horse race. But if you go to a battery conference, everybody says, my battery's better than your battery. And almost no one asks, what must any kind of battery compete with? Our next lecture is going to show how unexpectedly big the demand response term is. So is diversification in each of the 3 Midwest wind belt power pools from Texas to Canada. Wind farms in anti-correlated sites can yield the same firm output with less than half the capacity. And I guess I should probably redraw this graph, because now we know that efficient use, negawatts at the far left, and demand response, or flexawatts, next to it, are both about 3 times bigger than had been thought. So they push everything else off. Looking at this whole portfolio, bulk electricity storage is neither necessary nor sufficient for reliably running a modern renewable-dominated grid. Such a grid does have more moving parts and more variable output, and that requires good forecasting tools and more care and attention and thoughtfulness. But that's a soluble and indeed solved problem. It's not an insuperable obstacle. With proper operation, variable and flexible resources can reliably serve steady loads, not in the traditional way, giant thermal plants, but with renewables that meet even better the classical criterion for so-called baseload plants, that they have the lowest operating cost. So you dispatch them whenever they're available. Of course, just to make sure you grasp this, modern grids do not connect a single generator to a single load. Unless you're on a really small island, all generators serve the grid, and the grid serves all loads. So bulk electrical storage is not automatically required. Whether a specific generator runs at a specific time isn't relevant. What matters is the statistical reliability of the whole fleet of generators and the lines connecting them. The industry is very good at keeping those assets working reliably enough, although, as we'll see, not always resiliently, which is a different concept and a different need. Now, for balance, let me now give you some reasons why you might want to build electric storage capacity, either where electricity is produced or where it's used. And you could compare these benefits with other ways to do the same thing. These are from a great Northwest utility guru, Jim Lazar. He points out there's an analogy with a farmer growing a crop. The farmer doesn't want to build a truck fleet to haul crops every day to market and have to size it for the maximum possible rate of harvest, but rather, just like a silo lets a farmer get produce to market without such a big truck fleet, a megawatt of generation, if you have storage at the point of production, doesn't need a megawatt of wire to get to market. You can sell some at some times and some at other times. And then you can earn higher prices for firmer power, or you can play differences in price at different times. Producers can also smooth out minute-to-minute fluctuations in output this way. Or you could add storage at the load center. You could store cheap energy available at some times and use it when the prices are higher. You can gain resilience against failures in generation or transmission. You can help avoid having to build costly transmission lines that won't be used much. You can meet local peaks in your distribution area without adding grid capacity. The storage can supplement what the grid delivers. And you can provide virtual spinning reserve without needing lines to import it from far away. So for both these reasons, storage is actually being rapidly built, both at solar and wind farms and at load centers. And the objective is that as storage gets cheaper, we'll be able to produce power whenever the sun shines or the wind blows, transmit power whenever transmission capacity is available, and use power whenever we need it. So as Jim explains, with another analogy, transmission increasingly is like a trucking company. Every load it hauls should come with a price that helps pay for the trucks, the maintenance, the other costs. If you want it at a particular time, you pay more, but nobody gets a free ride. Of course, you have to do all this integration of the grid at a lot of different time scales, and that requires some rethinking and reversing how we run the grid. You see, traditionally, power plants were brought online and offline, turned up and down, fine-tuned moment to moment to match demand on timescales from milliseconds to hours or days. Grid resources were planned at a timescale of years to decades. And now climate protection requires also thinking at least a century ahead. But the basic paradigm for the past 140 years has been to match supply to load. Big thermal plants were run as steadily as they could. Then more flexible plants would adjust their output, ramping up or down to match fluctuating demand. But now both demand, aided by the information revolution, can and does follow the virtually costless supply from varying, nearly free-to-run solar and wind power. Some policymakers still don't understand that modern grids run not on base load, but on base cost. Best buys first, renewables. That is, as Jeff Layden says, flexible customer demand is moving utilities from a world where we forecast demand and schedule supply to a world where we will forecast supply and schedule demand. That's a very different world. A little context here. If you want to ramp up from 0 to 100% load, that takes about 90 minutes with a coal plant, 30 minutes with a heavy frame, or 10 with an aeroderivative, jet engine, open cycle gas turbine, 5 minutes with a diesel engine, 5 seconds with pumped hydro, and 0 with batteries or a renewable-driven inverter. So this graph, you notice, has a gap towards the right, be around 10 to the 6 or 7 seconds, that is weeks or months. That's where some skeptics see a gap in places that have seasonal dark doldrums, which the Germans call Dunkelflaute, where both sun and wind falter at the same time. As we'll see in a minute, this doesn't look like a serious problem, but analysis and debate continues on details of the already available solution. That might matter decades from now, where major regions are getting close to 100% renewable power, as described in hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. But we don't need to know now exactly what our resource mix will be when we get to the high 90s and up to 100% renewables. We only need to know, and we do know, that we already have ample and attractive options. As climatologist Ken Caldeira says, controversies about how to handle the end game should not overly influence our opening moves. So a bit about the Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums. In late 2021, the 99.999% reliable German and Belgian grid operator, serving over 30 million meters, published an important analysis for Europe. And they showed that seasonal complementarity between solar and wind power across Europe is so big that with expanded east-west interconnections, which would have been built long ago but for the Cold War, the region would need to generate power from green molecules in storage only for up to a week or two per year in periods of exceptionally low renewables. That's equivalent to about 6% of winter electricity use. And it would need only existing gas-fired capacity burning green molecules like hydrogen or ammonia made at other times from surplus solar and wind. So efficient use, strong electrification, and a triple pace of renewable deployment could thus manage Europe's seasonal fluctuations with, they said, no need in the power system for large-scale seasonal storage via green molecules. The study also found that flexawatts demand response can cut renewable power's under or oversupply days in 2050 by 90%. So unlike most previous work, this study included electric vehicle integration, heat pumps, behind-the-meter home batteries, and its strategy looks a lot cleaner, cheaper, and smarter than reliance on fossil fuel-based molecules, whether or not CO2 is released in producing them. So widespread claims that renewable grids would need months or seasons or years of long-duration storage from batteries are clearly not supportable. Now, about a decade ago, the National Renewable Energy Lab, using the best models available and with exhaustive peer review, choreographed reliable up to 80 or 90% US renewable electricity, lower 48 states, for periods of at least a year. So you can see the different instruments in Clay's orchestra going in and out as the daily resource stack scrolls by. Here's how NREL models the 30-year evolution of 60% renewable electricity. They also model up to 90, and that's not a limit, as we'll see. Notice the dwindling black splotches showing fossil-fueled and nuclear generation. The fluctuations shown are not daily, but they're seasonal, managed by the diversity of both supply and demand-side resources. For the most exceptional weather or a giant sky-darkening volcanic event, renewably produced hydrogen or other green fuels can be burned in existing gas plants, maybe semi-mothballed, but paid to stand ready as a capacity reserve in the way that a number of other places do. In 2021, NREL published a supply-side analysis of how much more it could cost the US to go from 90 or 95% to 100% renewable electricity by 2050. It wouldn't raise average cost much, but it would cost manyfold more in marginal cost for the last few percent, they said. However, I think that's probably because their model omits many important solutions that you saw in that notional supply curve earlier, especially in demand-side resources and in how the grid interacts with sectors like transport and process heat. More on that in the second half of this lecture. But for now, let me end by summarizing just the scenarios we examined over a decade ago in Reinventing Fire that are now looking sounder than ever. America's aging, dirty, insecure electricity system has to be replaced anyway by 2050. And using NREL's big model, but allowing renewables to become half distributed rather than all centralized, our Reinventing Fire analysis explored 4 electricity scenarios whose system cost is shown in red just above the legend at the upper right. And these scenarios ranged from business as usual to more of the same, to centralized renewables, to half distributed renewables. And it turned out that all 4 scenarios cost about the same in net present value, counting no externalities. But these 4 futures have profoundly different risks around national security, fuel, water, finance, technology, climate, and health. And we found that distributed renewables best manage all 7 of those risks, and they're the only way to eliminate the cascading blackout risk. Since we did this synthesis, another decade has proved the conservatism of our renewable cost projections, and it's revealed that renewables would actually cost less than the other 3 choices, rather than about the same. So the lowest risk scenario is also the lowest cost scenario, and it's what the market is picking. So all that, sorry, it was a lot, is the first part of this lecture 7. In the second and shorter part, we'll explore further details of the electricity transformation. So please take a break, and then we'll return for the rest of this fast-moving story. Thank you.